Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist, Thomas Flight, to talk about Danny Boyle's Sunshine. Before we begin, Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original podcast, meaning that on Nebula, you can listen to all of our episodes ad-free and a week early. And you'll also get access to a monthly bonus episode. Last month that was David Fincher's Fight Club. Be sure to use our personal link in the show notes to get a $20 discount on a yearly subscription. I also want to give a quick shout out to our Discord server, where we discuss movies with our listeners and take the occasional suggestion. If you want to join our little community, the link for that is also in the show notes. Now back to the show. Thomas, this was your first time watching Sunshine, right?
That's right, yes.
What was your first impression of it?
I was interested going into this one. I'd heard a bit about it here and there. I think I had even seen bits. I didn't remember enough that it was spoiled as I was watching it, but there were certain moments in this movie that popped up and I was like, oh, I saw somebody talk about that in an essay once or something.
Probably me.
That might be where
both in and out of context.
Yeah. So I've definitely seen it referenced in places or people talk about it. So I was curious to check it out. I'm also, a fan of some of Alex Garland's writing, some of his movies, and it's Danny Boyle. So I was pretty interested going in, and I enjoyed it. I think it explores a lot of interesting ideas. It goes kind of bonkers in the third act in a way that maybe predictably is appealing to me, perhaps you could say, based on my love of certain movies that go wild towards the end. So there's a lot of elements of this that I really enjoyed. There was a lot of stuff that also felt kind of a little messy to me, and I got tripped up a little bit. Like when I watch a movie like this, I try to really let myself get engaged in just the story as it is and not be too tripped up by like sci-fi elements that maybe don't quite like play. But I did get tripped up a little bit by what I would describe as like some of the wonky space mechanics.
I mean, like the airlock scene or something like that, or there's not a lot of moments where they're actually out in space, like out of the spacecraft.
Yeah. It's more like, the way things are moving in space. I don't know. It's just like there was just enough moments where it's not that like it was unbelievable. It was more like I felt like some of the stakes or what exactly was happening was not defined clearly enough that I got caught up in the suspense. Instead, I was a little bit confused about what was actually happening, which might be more on me than on the movie. I don't know. There was moments where I was like, I feel like the movie's like trying to get me to be like, what's going to happen? But instead I was like, what's happening? Which is not quite, I think, what it was going for. But I think there's a lot of elements that are really beautiful, some really cool ideas that are explored. So this is one of those movies I would slot into the category of like doing really interesting things in kind of a messy way.
But you did like the third act, you said. I think that's one of the main criticisms of this movie that's holding it back from being hailed as this science fiction masterpiece, is that it just becomes more of a slasher film towards the end. And
right.
Which I sort of feel the same way about. Yeah. We'll get into that. Yeah.
Yeah. It almost got progressively more messy and interesting to me simultaneously. Like the problems got compounded and the bits of it that I thought were interesting also increased, if that makes any sense. Yeah, I would say I really liked the first and the third act, even though the third act was the most messy, I think. I don't know. We can get into all of that. But I'm also just interested to kind of like discuss some of the ideas that are being presented here, the implications. Yeah. What about you, though? You are revisiting it now. How did you feel about it when you watched it before, and how do you feel about it now?
This is, I was going to say was, but it still is one of my favorite science fiction movies. I think it's because it's just so visually evocative. Like, I don't think there's any other movie about space that truly captures the sheer force that can be found there. Like, there's obviously here the power of the sun, but I often think about like in when you really think about space, the kind of dynamics that are at play there, like you have black holes like swallowing entire universes, there's stars exploding and stuff. There's all this drama and spectacle happening on a scale that's just so far beyond our comprehension. And I've often thought about how do you even begin to capture that in a way that conveys that in its proper grandeur. And because the difficulty is when you want to have that human perspective, when you want to portray it from a human being, from a more subjective lens, then it's just too big to fully. A human being is just too small to serve as a contrast to whatever is happening out there. But at the same time, if you zoom out to a point where it does, you can get it all into frame, so to say, then again, it loses that skill because there's no more anchoring point, or there's no point of reference that is anyway relatable for when it comes to size. You know, there's a lot of those videos on YouTube where you see the size of the moon and then the size of Earth, and then it scales up increasingly to the point where the first 10 planets or so, or first stars, just become these tiny dots, and the whole comparison essentially almost becomes meaningless just because of the sheer size difference. And so I think that's something that every space movie has to grapple with to some degree, at least any space movie that wants to depict the smallness of humanity against the grandeur of the cosmos. And I think Sunshine is one of the movies that does this. There's a lot of little details, like we're introduced to Searle, I think, Cliff Curtis's character. He is observing the sun, and then it's immediately revealed, oh, we're only seeing the sun at 2% of the full brightness. And then he's like, can we bump that up to 4 or something? And then, you know, the computer says, you know, you'll basically be blinded. And there's obviously the later sequences where they go out to fix the shield, and then I don't know, I just love the way they manage to depict the power of the sun, even when you're just getting glimpses of it, which such force that it really puts everything else into the appropriate, or at least as far as cinema will allow, you know, the appropriate perspective. There's one other scene that I'll mention here, and that's the scene where they watch Mercury passing across the sun, which feels like a pretty purposeful scene, or like a kind of a purposeless scene with regards to that it doesn't progress the plot in any significant way. It's one of my favorite little moments from this movie, actually, because it's such a nice, quiet moment so early on in the film, and it shows that, you know, against this giant fiery ball that we cannot even look at, like an entire planet is but this tiny black dot. And even though it's Mercury, it actually, you know, it makes you think about, oh wait, you know, Earth is also just one of those tiny little specks against this force that we're now moving towards, and that, you know, that's at the center of this universe. And I think it's a very effective scene at also helping you set those comparisons, or set those, what's the word I'm looking for here?
Scale. Yeah.
So yeah, that I think is what this movie does very effectively, especially in that first half. It's continuously, in various ways, contrasting the sun as this giant, literally, you know, incomprehensibly large force that these tiny human beings are up against, and that our entire planet actually is almost nothing compared to. And I think that I cannot really think of any other movie that does it quite like Sunshine does.
I don't know if it never does, but I can't remember a single frame where it shows like kind of the type of image you're describing, where the sun is tiny and like the spaceship is like this little blip moving towards a sun that's like small in the frame. Like until we see the sun from Earth at the end, you know, it's like almost always completely enveloping the entire screen, or a big portion of it, or something like that. Or we're seeing it from inside the ship, and it's just like, it feels constantly like not a tiny warm object in the sky that shines light down on us, like the perspective we get it from. It feels like this massive, you know, like pit of fire that they're just kind of dropping into the entire time.
Yeah, there's a little bait and switch at the beginning where you do see a little tiny sunshine, or that's how it appears, and then it looks like it zooms in, but then it turns out it's not the sun, but it's actually the reflection of the
Oh,
sun
yes.
of the spacecraft. And then we kind of pan into the other direction, and that's when the true force of the sun is revealed, and then the spacecraft is obviously becomes increasingly tinier in comparison to it.
Yeah. This is one I wish I would have been able to see in theaters, watching it. I have a pretty decent sized TV at home, but just like this is a movie that would benefit from those scenes where if the sun is enveloping the characters, it would really feel like it was just like enveloping the theater or you.
You'd need the sunglasses over on top of your 3D
exactly.
glasses.
And that little viewing room almost has like a very theatrical kind of feeling to it where you just sit in there and look into the sun. I love that that's something they established kind of early on with Cyril, where there's this like almost metaphysical like quality to looking into the sun, which is, something that we have kind of on Earth even, that, there's people who have beliefs about looking into the sun having like health benefits, or, obviously the worship of the sun is like historically a thing. But it was fun to see that kind of updated in this way, where I love how the fear of sort of what they're headed towards and the awe are kind of held in tandem simultaneously, and the connection of those two things are kind of palpable. That's where like I really was feeling the sort of Alex Garland kind of influence here. That's something I think he really is interested in exploring, this like knife's edge right on which something is like both terrifying and awe-inspiring at the same time.
There's also definitely that religious angle there where, the sun is, as you said, historically also at the source or has been a source of worship, and in many ways inspired or informed many of the religions that we still have today, and that they gave their own twist to, but that essentially started with worshiping of the sun. And I think, I don't think this movie is a literal metaphor or an allegory, is in the sense that the sun literally means God, but it does invoke some of the same dynamics where we have this force that gives us all of our life. The sun gives life, and then life looks back onto the sun, trying to figure out what it is and why, and what the purpose of it all is. And at the same time, it gives warmth, it gives life, it gives beauty, but at the same time, you cannot stare directly at it because you'll hurt yourself. And that's obviously that's what I like about Cyril throughout the movie. He gets like these blisters, and he tries to push it like a little bit more every time, and he gets hurt a little bit every time he does so. But I just like the idea that there's this longing to connect to something that powerful, while at the same time knowing that a true connection with that kind of source would also mean total self-destruction. Like those two go hand in hand. They cannot be separated from each other.
Yeah.
And I feel like in many, kind of a stretch there maybe, but to some extent I think that's also how a lot of religious people relate to God, I think. Whereas, it's at the same time all beauty, but at the same time also all powerful. Like there's no individual human that, at least not in the body, can encompass the fullness of God without that meaning some kind of destruction of the flesh, or that's something that can only happen in the spiritual realm. That's not something that can happen within earthly confines. And to me, at least, it seems like there's a lot of parallels there with the way the sun is depicted, and especially also with Cyril's character, how he relates to the sun. How that relates to religion.
Yeah. No, I think that connection is definitely there. I would assume, based on some of Garland's other work, that he's kind of doing that intentionally to some extent. And like I couldn't quote you the verses, but the idea of like looking at the face of God would essentially kill you or destroy you in some way is pretty explicit in Christianity, and I would imagine it probably appears in some other religions, although I'm less familiar. There's a very mystical concept that involves like seeing something fully for what it is, going hand in hand with some kind of destruction or annihilation or death, or, you know, and that's not like this movie, we can get more into it maybe once we get into discussing the end, doesn't explore that very explicitly. Like they don't step back and like talk about in exposition, like what happens if you look into the sun too much and it makes you go insane or something. We see that there's some kind of weird thing happening around these things. I kind of like that just sort of like is there. It doesn't set up in this very like explicit way. It just kind of like a subtext, or not a subtext.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's more of like a B storyline plot to the overarching arc of what's happening.
The interesting thing is that every character seems to have their own way of relating to the sun, which I think is an interesting way that this movie portrays that different kind of dynamic, basically to the essence of life. You know, everyone has, we cannot help but develop some kind of relation to existence in that most cosmic sense. And, you know, with Searle, I think we have the more spiritual side, this side that is kind of that looks upon the sun as this godlike force that you want to connect with, even though it hurts or even though it withers you away. And that is ultimately a humbling force. Like, I like his character for being, you know, very, I was going to say down to earth, but that's not quite correct. But he is still somewhat grounded within his human confines. Yeah, he's the one who recognizes, you know, we're only stardust, and we can only hope to get a glimpse of that, whatever bigger force there is out there. And whereas later on we meet Pinbacker, the former captain, I think it was, from the other crew. And he is also very much in this, you know, very much went down this spiritual path. He also has this very explicitly religious connection to the sun, which he literally compares to God. But he, instead of him being humbled by it, he develops a sort of grandiosity that he's now the last man alone with God, and it's wrong for us to do anything about his will, and which ends up in all kinds of violence and destruction. And so that to me was something that I always found very interesting about this film, that we have these two spiritual connections that both lead to very different paths and very different belief systems. And on the other side too, there's the more non-spiritual / atheist perspectives. You know, you have the atheist perspectives, and they too have different outcomes in how they lead to various qualities or virtues. You know, you have, I think most notably there's Harvey's character, the one who ends up being the comms officer on a ship without communication or without means for communication. And he kind of comes across as a very sober guy, spiritually speaking, like, but he also ends up being sort of scared by the sun, or being scared by the weight of existence, and he's the one who ultimately ends up faltering in the mission, because he isn't able to muster up the courage to be truly self-sacrificial when he has to.
Right.
Whereas on the other side, we also have Mace and Kappa, who are also both atheist, I think I would say. You know, Kappa has a very clearly I'm not sure mathematical is the right, you know, he has a physicist's perspective very clearly. But he sort of uses that to invoke his own sense of beauty from it. He explains how the bomb works and how it will bend space and time, and he describes it as being beautiful, and that fills him with courage and hope. And Mace too, he doesn't really, I think Mace is just the most pragmatic guy of them all. He's actually, this is the guy who was played by Chris Evans. This was actually one of my favorite characters. Every time I watch it, I just love his direct and down-to-earth attitude. I
did like him in this. He feels like, to me, he's deriving the most meaning from the sacrifice itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you think that that is a fair assessment?
I think in his own way, he is the most selfless, even though he's not without, like, he has like some anger issues, like he's brawling with Kappa at some point, and then later he does it again. But I admire him from being selfless in a way that I'm not sure that I would be in that situation, and that maybe that's why I feel sort of drawn to him, or I see him as kind of aspirational in that sense. He also has one of the best uses of the word literally in any movie. They discuss going to the other Icarus project or the other Icarus ship, and then he's like, "Wait, to be clear, like we're not doing this, right? And that's when he explains the mission. And it's a kind of a bit of exposition, but he goes like, if the sun dies, we die, everything dies. There's literally nothing more important than that.
Yeah.
I just love that line so much because I cannot think of any usage of that word in the movie that was a more correct use of that word. But yeah, that aside, I think I love the way he, as we said, he ends up being this very selfless dude. He's ready to sacrifice himself. He's ready to sacrifice anything to complete this mission. But at the same time, I love the way the movie also doesn't sugarcoat the real implications of this. I think he is one of the more brutal death scenes, I would say. At least one of the more, It's not like I did my heroic thing, now I'm just going to get washed up in the sunlight. He is down there in the cooling tank. He has his leg stuck and he's freezing, and his death is like a slow and a painful one, and he knows it. He's like squirming a little bit, and I don't know. There's something about that that's always affected me for some reason, and I think it's because of that he on the one hand has that very self-sacrificial attitude, but at the same time that it also we also get to see what that ultimately costs him, which in hindsight only makes that self-sacrificial attitude feel even more earned, maybe, or in some way,
Right.
That depicts that he was truly willing not just to like sacrifice himself, but also to suffer for what he believed in. And so, I don't know, he's just, he's in some ways just the ultimate pragmatic dude who completely takes himself out of an equation when he's assessing like risk and meaning, and when the way he navigates that mission is completely without, or at least it seems completely without self-regard and
Right.
or without regard for his own life. Yeah.
I think you're right, but I also would say, like, I'm curious about what distinguishes him from Kappa, who also has this very like utilitarian, let's crunch the numbers, figure out what the best move is, and just do that. And there's a slight difference between them. And I think, to me, my perception is kind of that Mace, like, there's something about that move of sacrificing himself that is deeply meaningful to Mace in and of itself. Like, he's like, I've got to do it, but you know what? This is what we have to do. Let's just go in there. Whereas Kappa, to me, is also willing to kind of like sacrifice himself, but it feels a little different to me, where he's just like, well, this is just what has to be done. It doesn't necessarily like, he sees the beauty in it, or it's not like he denies the meaning in it, but he's not like chasing that sacrifice necessarily for its own sake. He's like completely in the realm of, I just want this certain outcome to happen, and whether I pull it off through sacrifice or live or survive or die or somebody else does it or whatever is like completely unimportant to me. The only thing that matters is that it happens. I see a slight differentiation there.
Yeah, I think they just have a very different personality in terms of how they handle their own emotions, which gives them a lot of texture, even though them being roughly on the same page philosophically. Because I love the way that, they struggle throughout the movie, but they also have that nice little moment where they make up with each other, and they make it right. Mace comes in like they start apologizing to each other, and then Kappa interrupts Mace when he says like, okay, let me do the apology, and then it falls silent, and Kappa's like, that was it.
Yeah.
And Mace's like, yeah, I'll consider it accepted. There's something about Kappa that he's mission oriented, obviously, but I think he also has a sort of curiosity towards the the physics of what will happen at the end of the journey, and the kind of beauty that he's going to witness something that's completely outside of any rational model, because, we go through the mission at some point, or through the simulation of the explosion, which clearly states that at some point the simulation ends because there's not enough data to calculate what's going to happen. And that's when Kappa, I think, explains that, there's going to be a literal bending of time and space. And I think there's, to him, a more, kind of the romantic scientist element, where he's also driven by that curiosity to experience something that's outside any models that humans have been able to come up with up until that point. Whereas I feel like Mace, in comparison to that, is more like the soldier on the ground.
Yes, that's a great way of putting
it. He's going for the mission, or that's all that matters to him, and anything else that's byproduct. He doesn't feel like, at least to me, he doesn't feel like someone who has that romantic connection to the sun. To him, it's just, there's a task that needs to be done, and I'm taking my ego out of it, and I'm doing everything I can to commit myself to that. I always found both characters to be very compelling. I actually like all of the characters in this movie in their own little way. I think, there's also Curzon, the Michelle Yeoh's character.
Yeah.
The botanist, I think.
Just one of the many lives of Evelyn Wong split off into the multiverse. This is just the universe where she lives out.
Space botanist,
yeah.
But I love her character for having really this appreciation of the life that's granted by the sun.
Yeah.
I actually think Cassie's character is, on rewatching it, she feels more of slightly weaker than the other ones.
She's kind of there, I thought, like, she wears a little cross, and she's kind of the stand-in for, I'm trying to think of what the counter to the utilitarian perspective, which is like the calculation between saving all of humanity and saving one person's life is very easy in a utilitarian view.
Yeah.
You just crunch the numbers and you're like, okay, it's fine to kill this person. And she's the one who's kind of standing in there going like, hey, let's maybe not, or like, maybe we should try, maybe it would be wrong to kill that person even in this instance, which I appreciate that somebody's there, like kind of giving a voice to that philosophy, because I'm not like strictly utilitarian. So I think there's an interesting argument to be had between the perspectives. But in this case, it just ends up kind of falling so flat because in terms of like, if you're going to make an ideally utilitarian argument, or like set up a thought experiment where like a utilitarian answer is like easily the correct answer, this is the one. It's like all of humanity versus one human's life. And it's pretty unambiguously like a trade-off. So you kind of just have to trolley problem the one guy, or like, run him over with the trolley to save 9 million grandmas or something back on Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that scene wasn't so much about her seriously arguing for Trey's life instead of for the mission. I think she's more of the voice of mercy or of compassion, because obviously we're going in between one life and the literal fate of this solar system. Obviously that one life is expendable. But I think that her character was sort of supposed to be this voice that then, at least, given this cold hard reality wherein one life doesn't matter, there still is grounds for compassion, and at least show a kindness, even if the odds or the world turns out to be cruel in some way. Or
she's the only one who sheds a tear for him.
Yeah. But yeah, I think my main issue with her is that her character just doesn't get as much screen time to really demonstrate her side of the philosophy. And maybe that was kind of the point, that her aspect of, at least what she represents in this discussion metaphorically now, that she's kind of put on the back burner, because in a way to show that whenever there's a crisis situation like this, that kind of voice tends to be suppressed by other ones, and then it only comes up in a situation like that where the absence of it would just be total cruelty.
Right, right.
I did really like that discussion. And I think in general, the way this movie presents arguments and makes discussions is one that I have also always found really enjoyable, because maybe going back to the premise of the movie that we haven't directly talked about.
Yeah.
We open with this prologue where Kappa explains that the sun is dying, mankind faces extinction, and we have this crew of astronauts that's going with this big bomb. Pretty much every bomb collected, or all the materials that were harvested from Earth, used to create this one bomb that's going to be set off in the sun, and that's going to create a star within a star, supposedly, and that's going to reignite the sun. I don't know what the probability of a premise like that is. Like, does it make sense? Is it complete gibberish? I never really cared about it. For me, if the movie opens with something like that, this is the premise. This is the kind of suspension of disbelief that's going to be necessary for the rest of the story. I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
The story kind of starts off with them being 24 hours away from arriving in the dead zone, which is the point past which there's no more communication back home, and so they'll be totally on their own. When they enter that, the first significant event that happens is that they catch the signal of the previous mission that was sent a couple of years back, but that wasn't successful. And so that's what starts, that's the first potential fork in the road that's going to lead to a change in the plot or the change in the expected mission. I don't know about you, but I just love the way that whole conversation played out. We have Mace there with explaining how the importance of the mission, that there's no way in hell they're going to deviate from it, and convincingly so. But then I love the way Searle, as the ship's psychologist, very gently almost maneuvers into that, and he kind of maneuvers around Mace's high intensity or higher emotionality to really make a pretty reasonable point given the situation. He argues that the way the bomb works is entirely theoretical, and then he ultimately ends up arguing that maybe it's better to have 2 last chances than 1. And yeah, again, I don't know about you, but I just love the way that the movie really takes you along with the kind of deliberations behind behind the course of the plot, essentially, in a way that you, at least for me, I was like, okay, maybe it's a bad idea, maybe it's a good idea. I can kind of see the arguments, and I'm on board for whatever happens next. And then, there's obviously human failure coming up later, but I don't know if you want to add something to this or...
No, the way that unfolded, I enjoyed, because Mace kind of states his thing and you're kind of like, yeah, he's right. And then Cyril makes his counterpoint and you're kind of like, ooh, that is actually a good counterpoint. Okay, we need to consider this. And then the way it just kind of slowly pulls you into all right, now Kappa's the one who's going to have to make this decision. The way that maneuver is pulled off works very nicely. And I love that they also don't immediately default to we're taking a vote. Where everybody has their voice. It's it feels more organic in how there's several different scenes in this movie where as a group people are making decisions, and it felt like it explored the different ways that happens really well and thoroughly in a way that feels believable to the characters. I think it's a really strong movie in that regard. When I say it's messy, I think none of the mess is really in how the interpersonal mechanics are written at all. I think in terms of the actual dialogue between characters, how characters are getting into conflict and resolving it, it works. That's one of the things it's doing best. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I had a much bigger point to make with that, except for that I wanted to say that that's something that I really enjoy in science fiction movies in general, because whereas I think a lot of films tend to look down upon heavy debating discussions, and especially if they feel kind of exposition-y.
Right.
Especially with science fiction movies, I always love when there's actual discussions being held on screen instead of having just this quick back and forth and then have like this half-baked reason to progress the plot instead of this more deliberate and more measured approach that really brings you into the headspace of the characters. And as you said, it also reveals a lot about the characters in just a very little space. You know, you don't have to do a lot of character moments, quote unquote, when you can just show character through how they behave themselves or how they carry themselves in a discussion or in a dialogue. And yeah, that's something that I really enjoyed. Maybe also I like the way it kind of ended up that that whole discussion ended with a conclusion where no matter how you look at it, you still end up in uncertainty. And I think there's a thematic significance there where no matter how you position ourselves, there's no certainty at the end of it. There's always going to be a bit of a leap of faith, no matter what we do,
Right.
and no matter how certain we feel about some choice or decision, there might still be some uncertainty at the end of it, hidden in the details, so to say. But yeah, and from there we kind of move on to, I think, the second big event that really upsets the success rate of the mission, which is that Trey, Benedict Wong's character, he makes a calculation error when he adjusts the course of the ship, and then he forgets to alter the angles of the shield, and that leads to a whole sequence, which also introduces, one of the best soundtracks of any movie, which has been used a lot in trailers and stuff, and I can see why it's. But yeah, that after that whole sequence, the whole mission is kind of flipped on its head, and the captain dies. They lose their oxygen, I think. That's also what happened. Yeah, they lose the oxygen, or the oxygen garden. So at that point, the mission goes from there's a small chance we're gonna make it and then make it back home, and it changes that into, okay, we are at least now certainly gonna die. This is now a one-way trip, and yeah, I love the way that. I was gonna say subtly, but it's not such a subtle escalation. But it doesn't feel like a big shift at first, whereas it already feels like the mission is kind of desperate. There's still a difference in believing. I think Cassie at one point says this even, that there's one thing in believing you might, or worrying about maybe not returning home, and between knowing you're definitely not gonna return.
Yeah.
And that's something that really interested me, because that really brings the question of mortality into the whole thematic space, where characters are now just, we talked about the sun as being this force of, almost this godlike force, it lived way before us, it's gonna live way after us, it's too big for us to comprehend, and now we are really, with these characters now being on a suicide mission, we really see their mortality being contrasted against this force now, and I don't know, there's something about that just I found very compelling about the way that sort of changes the characters also, and the way they each react in their own way. We've talked about this earlier, so I'm gonna skip the way that Harvey still acts kind of cowardly, even though he knows they're all gonna die probably, but he just doesn't want to be the next one, or
he doesn't want to be the first to go, or just in that moment, like actually facing like a decision where it's like, it's one thing to be like, okay, I know I'm gonna die now in the future in a way that's out of my control. And it's another thing to be like, I'm making the conscious choice now to do something that's going to directly lead to my death. And he's unwilling to kind of take that leap.
I think that's the point I was kind of struggling to make, that kind of distinction between mortality as this abstract concept that we know that's a part of being a human
Yeah.
being, or what it means to be a human being, but at the same time also being aware of mortality conceptually is not the same as facing it directly. And I think that's something that this movie also deals with in an interesting way. But yeah, and then I think that's when we get to Pinbacker also.
Yeah, once they kind of reach Icarus 1, they go in, they look around.
They even make a joke about not splitting up and then
yeah, there's like an
saying,
alien.
"Oh, that's not a good idea," and then
they're
well,
gonna...
but you think there's going to be an alien picking us off one by one?
Searle makes his Stardust to Stardust comment in there at some point. Yeah, they start kind of accepting this, like, you know, this impending doom. This weird other character shows up. We don't find out about him. I forget if he starts picking people off on Icarus 1, or is it only after he sneaks
Only
in?
after because he sneaks back,
yes,
and then he breaks the airlock, and that's when
the
other 4, they end up being trapped there, and that's when we get that whole sequence.
The sequence where Harvey freezes in space, and then the shot, I mean, it's like morbid and dark, but the shot where he's like flying out across, and he's a little dot, and then he just like breaks into the sunlight and just like instantly dissolves.
Like a little fart.
Yeah, was a great sequence. It's one of those moments that you were kind of describing earlier where like the constant, never-ending sort of like power of the sun is just like a constant presence in this movie.
I also want to mention that just before that moment, we talked about the characters earlier and the different paths towards the same virtues. And I think that's also a sequence that really beautifully shows, you have that moment where Kappa is in the suit, Harvey is initially against it. And then, he kind of comes around to, okay, Kappa's in the suit, we're going to jump with him. And then they realize someone has to stay back and manually operate the airlock or something. And then Harvey's like, oh, you're all thinking, I get it. You're all thinking that should be me. And I love the way Searle steps up and he just calmly states like, no, Harvey, it's me. Because I like the way that in that attitude or in that moment, he has basically the same attitude that Mace has when it comes to recognizing his priority within the group, even though, as we talked about earlier, they both have varied dispositions when it comes to their spirituality, I guess. But I love the way they sort of connect there in the end, where they both display that same kind of humility that gives them the courage or the drive to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Searle also was looking for his opportunity to immolate himself in the with Sunshine in that scene, which is a great one as well. He sort of meets the end that it feels like he's kind of been like wanting this whole time, like to really just see what this thing is. It's interesting if you're thinking about this in terms of mortality and how different people face mortality, because people have different approaches to death or feel different ways about it. And it's like you have some people who will really approach it with a Harvey-like attitude where they're like, there's some people who want to meet that in some sort of meaningful way, like sort of Mace. And then there's like Searle, who seems like he just wants to be as open as possible to the experience itself, like to just feeling what that feels like, even if that's what destroys him in that moment.
Yeah, I was going to say as a final note there that also there's a nice contrast in the way that Searle goes out on his own terms and, as you said, with open eyes as he kind of wanted to, whereas Harvey then his sort of scared, more cowardly attitude also makes him go out, not explicitly, but at least symbolically in a way that, he just kind of bumps and struggles and kicks and screams his way until death just overtakes him without him having any agency or any comfort in that process. And I think there's definitely a deliberate contrast with Harvey sort of disappearing in the dark and Searle being swallowed by light at the end there, almost simultaneously.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's then we get Pinbacker back on the ship. one of the more controversial turns in the story, I think. Even though I love his introduction, he has some great monologues throughout the third act. I do really like I get what his character was supposed to do in this story. Like I see where he fits in thematically, and he kind of reminded me in some way of the Dr. Mann character in Interstellar. That kind of third act human obstacle to what would otherwise be the more environmental struggle of the characters. But yeah, especially now in hindsight, I do feel like it becomes too much of a slasher film where he even seems to have like superhuman strength for some reason towards the end there. And, I wouldn't have erased, or I wouldn't have wanted him entirely gone from the movie, because I do like, as I said, he has some great dialogue. He's performed pretty great, I think, also by Mark Strong. But I wish his character had less of an impact on the course of the climax of the movie. I wish it had been more like Interstellar, where he forms a brief obstacle, but then we return with like full focus on the environmental struggle and the struggle against the cosmos.
Yeah.
Because now, I don't know, it just plays out too long, and he's there like way until the very end, and that's when the camera, it starts going bonkers, as you said. You kind of enjoyed it, but for me, it does. I find like the visual intensity becomes slightly too aggressive here, with the camera shakes and the distorted angles and the defocus and the quick cutting. It just becomes, I don't know, it becomes a little overwhelming for me.
The chaos at the end just becomes too much. And I think his character thematically the muddies the water a little bit. Like I'm not exactly sure what the implications are. I think there's interesting stuff where what we talked about earlier, where he's kind of like saying like, hey, we can't meddle with sort of God or fate or whatever in this, the sun dying is just sort of like the natural course of things, and we should not be meddling with that, essentially. It's kind of the position he's operating from, and then he's trying to sabotage things.
Yeah. I think he's just that token of religious grandiosity, where he kind of denies the literal reality of things to impose his own narrative of it. I don't know if I can think of an apt comparison. Something like, let's say, some people are warning, the scientists are warning for a volcanic eruption. There's data that's measuring the objective activity of the volcano, but then there's some priest that says, oh no, I know what the will of God is. I know everything's going to be fine, and becomes really aggressive about it. And
Or in this case, it's more like he's saying, yeah, the volcano exploding is part of the will of God, so we shouldn't try to stop it anyway. We just need to accept our fate, dying at the hands of this volcano. The irony kind of there being like, if it's truly the will of God, you're not going to stop him anyway, theoretically. So like a man having to fight for what he thinks is like the will of God is kind of irrational in a sense.
He kind of assumes like if the will of God is one thing, he essentially takes away human freedom and agency, but then at the same time he is imposing his own agency to make sure that whatever he thinks is the will of God does in fact happen without the agency of others being able to intervene.
The way I read it was a little bit more, I think there's maybe some commentary on religious stuff there, but also like, to me, watching it the first time, I was just like, this guy just ate too much sun. He like, went insane, and just like something about being near this space. And this is where it kind of gets like Alex Garland-y towards the end. And that was kind of what I liked about it, where it like feels like they almost cross over this threshold and things start just getting weirder. And there's sort of like an incomprehensibility that enters into the space, and what's happening with his character is kind of unknowable, and sort of in the same way, I don't know, it just starts getting strange and like incomprehensible, I guess is a good way of putting it. That was what I liked about it, in the sense that like as things start to disintegrate towards the end there, I was less sure of what was really happening and how and why. I like how that sort of represents this idea of like, you're nearing something that you know you have to do, but space and time are sort of bending as you're doing that. And your ability to understand what's happening is sort of disintegrating as you're doing that. But ultimately, I think like if that's what they were going for in this movie, I think that particular idea was better explored in something like Annihilation, like pulls that specific like incomprehensibility off a little bit better. But I like that sort of thing anyway, so I was having fun with it. Like the movie's definitely doing one kind of thing for like a while, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, we're gonna go this way and do this other thing. I don't know if the problem is what it's doing necessarily so much, at least for me, as it almost gets messy. On one hand, it's incomprehensible in a way that I like. There was moments of that I like, but then there was other bits like when Kappa gets onto the bomb, I like completely had lost track of where Pinbacker and Rose and Cassie were. And then they show back up and I was like, I thought something had already happened to them. I was confused at that point in a way that also felt like I wasn't supposed to be. So I don't know if I missed some details or something, but.
Yeah, that final confrontation plays out strangely. I love the way, that jump from the ship to the bomb that Kappa makes, that, where we have the soundtrack again, climaxing. I feel like that's the big, like the interstellar shot where they go into the black hole or slingshot out of it. But yeah, after that, I wish there would have been more of a character moment, or at least maybe between Cassie and Kappa, or just Kappa alone, instead of having the final few minutes of the movie still being this physical struggle with the bad guy. And I feel like that's kind of also a missed opportunity where Cassie could have had like one final, more of a character moment, instead of her just being the one that does some stabbing and then dies herself. And the actual ending then, the bomb, the geography of it kind of looks strangely. And I think at that point also the whole gravity and stuff is shifting around, but Kappa sets off the bomb successfully. We get this really beautiful ending, which is one of my favorite visual sequences in any movie, probably. Kind of the chaos makes way for more ambient, quieter music. We get this moment of stillness, and then instead of having this big, giant bang essentially as an ending, it kind of softly fades through white, through light, fade to white instead of a fade to black, back to Earth, where we now see the sun shining a little bit brighter over a frozen world. So it is a success, I guess.
What's the implication?
We then get one of the worst needle drops to the credits in any movie.
I was so confused.
I didn't even I knew it was there, but for some reason I keep blocking that out of my mind because
it's a weird choice.
I dislike when movies do that, when they feel like the moment the credits hit, like the people aren't still in the emotion that they were experiencing during the conclusion. Like I cannot understand why you would go for something that's so jarring, but it
was 2007, so different time, I guess.
I love the ending aside from the cut to credits, but
I love the subtlety of the back on Earth moment. You could have had this big like climactic like soaring music and like the sun doing something crazy, but it just kind of goes from like, ooh, it's a little what looks like a hazy, foggy day to like, oh, you just turn the brightness slider up a little bit. The softness of that I love, because it also kind of like drives, they've been facing this thing that for this entire movie has been like this fireball about to like eat them alive. And then it just recontextualizes it from our own perspective, where it's like, oh, there's this thing that is much more manageable to us. But also like if you just dimmed it a little bit permanently, it would have massive, repercussions on our ability to survive. There's something about that relationship at the end and grounding us back in like our own relationship to the sun that I really liked. and just kind of the subtlety of that.
Definitely, definitely invokes a kind of appreciation that there's sort of more the kind of the astrological or astronomical, which is the real science one, astronomy. I think.
Astronomy, yeah, it's real.
Yeah.
Astrology is the one you got to look out for.
That's the horoscope one. It feels like the Carl Sagan type appreciation where you kind of zoom out all the way into the cosmos, see all the impossible mathematical odds that have led to things being exactly the way they are, and then zooming all the way back into what that means for us, that all those giant, endless, big forces came together in a way that allowed us to stay, just with the sun just perfectly shining on our little blue dot in a way that we could, play out this whole human drama. And I don't know, it's just it's a weirdly comforting perspective. I don't know if comfort is the right, at least it's humbling, I'd say.
Yeah.
I do have one final question before we wrap up. Going back to the sort of metaphor of the sun as being this source of worship, maybe even being a symbolical stand-in for God or some kind of higher divine being. What does this movie say thematically about the idea of human beings going in and reigniting that force that has, before the events of the film at least, been dimmed to the point where it threatens our existence?
That's interesting. I didn't really think about it in those terms.
I'm not sure if it's intended to, because the premise feels so, it's almost presented to you so casually at the beginning.
Right.
The sun is dying, we're gonna boot it back up. But, I wonder if there's a thematic relevance there that goes overlooked because of the way you almost take that premise for granted.
I would have to think about that a little bit more. The connection my brain immediately wants to make is like, the act of doing that requires some kind of act of faith. Like, these characters have to sacrifice themselves and do something in order to make it in there. And they have to do so not knowing whether that's really going to accomplish that goal. And I think there's something kind of profound in that. Like, any sort of act of faith that we make as humans, I think, by definition, being an act of faith, whether it's a religious act of faith or not, is one that we have to do not knowing what the outcome of that act of faith will be. Like that, to me, that's kind of what makes it an act of faith. So I think there's something interesting there where there are things we have to do as humans. Increasingly, it kind of feels like this when we look towards the future. You can look towards the future in religious terms, you can look towards the future in scientific terms and see obstacles that need to be overcome or whatever. In any case, however you look at it, there's like things that we have to do in our lives now, or a stance we have to take, or something like that. The lives we're living now, we can't know what the impact of that is going to be on people who live 400 years after us, or even, 100 years after us. And so we have to make all these decisions about what do we do? How do we live? What are the implications of this? How do we avert this crisis, that we might be coming in the future or something? And just believe that doing this thing is going to lead to this outcome. And there's a sense in which this is getting really speculative. There's a sense in which that move itself, that ability to engage in doing something, not knowing what the outcome will be, but with the hope and the faith of a certain outcome, is very integral to sort of human life to begin with.
Yeah.
That's part of the fuel that allows us to operate at all.
I agree that I think there's a large part that says something about, the movie obviously on more than one occasion, from whatever angle, spiritual, non-spiritual, or, physical or religious, emphasizes some kind of fundamental uncertainty at the heart of things. And that no matter what, it's going to take a leap of faith in order to act towards it in some way or another. The movie ends almost with that literal leap of faith from Kappa to from the ship to the bomb that's disconnected. And I think at the same time, it also, it clearly says something about the way we almost embody that uncertainty within ourselves. Do we use it as to humble our character or to like inflate it into something grandiose or self-important, or towards something that sees itself as part of a bigger whole, just, one small part of the greater good? But yeah, what that says about the idea of reigniting a dying sun, I asked the question without having thought about the possible answer myself, but I haven't thought about it too much because it feels like it's first and foremost almost like the plot mechanic or just the excuse to explore what the story becomes along the way, instead of what the premise and the outcome of it really mean on their own.
Yeah, it's hard to tie an implication to the dying sun because in theory it's like just something that's happening. It's not like the sun is dying because something that the humans have done, or we don't know much about the scenario.
We don't know a lot about the society they left behind. So
yeah,
I want to say the dying sun is obviously, you can see it, read maybe into it the loss of faith, maybe.
Right.
Although I wouldn't necessarily say it's an argument for a loss of religion in a growingly secular world, but more maybe of a loss of faith in a more general sense, a loss of hope, a loss of will to believe in that good things will happen in the future. And then to ignite that, it meant that display of sacrifice and courage and determination. And that's in the end what ignites it back into something that everyone on Earth can draw hope from, knowing that all these astronauts went on this mission, went through the things that they went through, and then ended up sacrificing themselves in that process, all based on this leap of faith, basically, all based on not knowing that it would even work, So yeah, there's, I think, a feeling of hope then in that reignition that spreads out back to Earth to inspire everyone who's still back home.
Alex Garland is someone who, if you look at his work together, to me seems, I think he's talked about being an atheist. I don't remember exactly, but he's pretty clearly like, I think his beliefs are fairly like scientific materialism, something along those lines, or more or less. But he's also really deeply interested in portraying the experience of life with sort of a mystical tone. Like he wants to take things that are like, this is just science or material or whatever, but engaging with that feels like this religious experience to the characters in his story. And that's kind of the way he's presenting that. You could kind of see it through that lens of like a sense of religious awe dying out as we move into a time where, we're in a secular age, as Charles Taylor would put it, or we're a post-Nietzsche world. Science is the dominant worldview. Alex Garland kind of with this movie or any others are like, but what if within even that there is this like deeper, more profound experience that you could have, that is kind of almost mystical in a sense. And I think you see that really clearly, like at the end of this movie, it's like, Kappa is being like consumed by the sun. It's like he slows everything down to this sort of infinite moment, and it takes on this profound, it's not just a guy being eaten by the sun. It's like the way it's presented it has almost this like deep, intimate, like, I don't know how you would even describe it, but like the experience is being presented in a kind of like a mystical way. That's how, it seems to me.
It's almost like the kind of marriage between the sun and humanity that Searle was hoping for.
Right.
Where instead of one destroying the other, it feels like a more mutual coming together, a sort of,
right,
a more friendly, compassionate synchronicity, I guess.
The language that the sun knows is heat and fire. So if we go in there and we drop a bomb, it loves it. It's like, now you're speaking my language.
I'm sure that's what they were going for, yeah. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula. Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original show, meaning that here you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. Last month, that was David Fincher's Fight Club. Before that, we've also covered Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, the new All Quiet on the Western Front, Alien Covenant, Drive, and many others. So you're really getting a whole new catalog of episodes. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the show notes, and we'll see you again next time.